So, bureaucracy is chapter 13. Please take a second to read this chapter. Lots of terms, lots of things that may not actually come like second nature to you, because bureaucracy is sort of the hidden pieces of government that the media doesn't talk about a lot. Government teachers, we don't talk about it a lot. It's just there. It's one of those pieces of government that we have to have in order for government to get to you and interact with you. But we don't talk about it a lot because it's very confusing. It changes depending on what department you're looking at, what issue you're trying to solve, what regulation is in place. And so, again, like I said, we're going to stay really broad, talk a lot about concepts and ideas. If you want to get into more specific details that you may want to gather to use for an FRQ, you may want to be looking in your book. Okay, so bureaucracies are not just part of governments. Bureaucracy, in its definition, is a complex group of people who work together to get something done. Bureau in French means office or desk. Think of this as offices that work together for one common goal. So here's the thing. People often hear the word bureaucracy and they automatically attach it to government, but that's not necessarily true. We have bureaucracies in universities, in large corporations, any organization that's structured in a specific way to have a specific output. I'm sorry. Yep, it's a large organization of workers for a shared goal.
And they're all nonprofits?
No, they can be public or private. They can be private corporations, they can be public entities, they could be nonprofit organizations, but things like universities, major corporations, things like Google is a bureaucracy. Trying to think of Apple would be considered a bureaucracy. Usually a bureaucracy is organized hierarchically, meaning that there is a clear leader and then things kind of trickle down. Like you looked at when you looked at the White House office, there are some different kind of organization styles to bureaucracy, but essentially it's this idea that there's usually someone way up on top who makes big decisions, all the way down to people who are day-to-day working with everyday people to get those decisions out. Government bureaucracies are not organized to make a profit, so that's kind of what's going to set it apart from a private bureaucracy. A private bureaucracy is going to try and make profit. A public bureaucracy isn't organized for a profit. It's organized to get out initiatives and ideas that the legislative or executive branch were to implement, but they're not there to make money off of you. They're intended to perform their functions as efficiently as possible to conserve taxpayers' dollars. Now, there is obviously some vague pieces here. What I would consider efficient, you might not consider efficient. What I consider an okay use of my tax dollars, you might not consider an okay use of your tax dollars. So this is where bureaucracy starts to become controversial. Because what we started to see is that it's becoming a political issue of what I use my bureaucracy for. Should my bureaucracy be large and extensive, or should it be small and sort of stay out of my everyday life? That's going to be the problem once we get into the political side of this. Okay, we have a couple of models of bureaucracy that we need to just be aware of. There are actually a lot of different models. Your book takes a look at 3 specific models. First is the Weberian model. This is a model of bureaucracy developed by Max Weber. He's a German sociologist. He viewed bureaucracy as rational, hierarchical organizations in which decisions are based on logical reasoning. I'll say that again. He viewed bureaucracy as rational, hierarchical organizations in which decisions are based on logical reasoning. So Max Weber really looks at bureaucracy as a sociologist. A sociologist studies people's behavior in society. And he thinks that a bureaucracy should have a clear leader and clear followers, and that it should work to serve in a logical way. That the way that it makes sense is the way that it should happen. Okay? Second model is the acquisitive model. This is a model of bureaucracy that views top-level bureaucrats as seeking to expand the size of their budgets and staffs to gain greater power. So this views top-level bureaucrats, big top-level, higher-up CEOs or leaders or whatever, as trying to expand the size of their budget and their staff to get more power. So the acquisitive model doesn't really look at it logically. They just sort of say, how can I get more power? How can I get a bigger staff? How can I get more money? How can I be more powerful? It's very top level heavy, not looking at those who are at the ground level, those who would work with you or I, people who are way up there making big decisions. They're trying to gain as much power as possible. And then the last one is monopolistic model. This is a model of bureaucracy that compares bureaucracy to monopolistic business firms. Lack of competition in either circumstance leads to inefficient and costly operations. So this is the idea that when bureaucracies eat up all other bureaucracies and we don't have competition for the best, most efficient bureaucracy, things are going to become a problem. A monopolistic model is the idea that bureaucracy should be small. It should stay small, and it should stay small and compete with others. And if it can compete with others, it should survive. And if it can't compete with others, it should not survive. In an ideal world, if we could match these things up to ideologies, a monopolistic model is very much like a conservative idea that we should have bureaucracies that compete with each other. If the public bureaucracy isn't helping it out, we should contract private businesses to do those things. It's like public schools, private schools. If public schools are too big, too large, not getting to use a student on a one-to-one basis, then you should be able to have a competing school, maybe a private school, that offers that opportunity to you. That means that that bureaucracy is more efficient to you, it's more purposeful to you. And so we compare these bureaucracies. The federal bureaucracy of the United States enjoys a large degree of autonomy, as many other nations. Our bureaucracy is one of the largest, it's one of the most complex, but it's also one of the most advanced and individual bureaucracies. We don't have to answer to a lot of people. Our federal bureaucracy really runs itself. And so we often rely on that to continue for our everyday needs. It is probably surprising to you if we really sat down and looked at it, how much you interact with the bureaucracy every single day. I mean, first and foremost, you come to a public school that's funded by public taxpayer dollars. You're interacting with your bureaucracy every time you come to school. Every time you go get your license renewed, every time you need to go get a hunting license, a fishing license, anytime that you get a speeding ticket, anytime that you need a social security check, or you need to apply for changes in your employment status, every time you file taxes, you're constantly interacting with what we consider the bureaucracy. Part of the bureaucracy is what we call administrative agencies. These are federal, state, or local government units established to perform a specific function. These are the things that you interact with every day. An administrative agency is going to be your Social Security office, your Department of Motor Vehicles, your police station, your school district. All of those things are what we consider administrative agencies. Things that you may not always consider bureaucracy. Well, I would assume that you would consider this voting. Anytime you go register to vote, that's bureaucracy. Now we've got a lot of places for people to go access the healthcare market. That's part of the bureaucracy. Okay, let's talk about the size. So in 1789, when the new government's bureaucracy started, there were 3 departments in the bureaucracy. There was the State Department, which had 9 employees. There was the War Department that had 2 employees. And the Treasury Department, which had 39 employees. We also had the Office of the Attorney General. So we're looking at about 50 employees to run our government. Now, obviously, our government isn't as vast as it is today. Our country wasn't as vast as it is today. But the thing is that we started our country by running it with about 50 people. Currently, we're at about 2.7 million civilian federal employees. Now, again, you have to remember that federal employees are a lot of pieces that we may not even consider federal employees. Post office workers. I was a state employee for working for a history organization. Librarians, archivists, tour guides, national park workers. They're all considered federal employees. So there are a lot of people here. Sometimes they're not people who just work behind a desk all day. By the way, this 2.7 million excludes the military. So we're not counting military in here. We have millions of private subcontractors. This is becoming a much more extensive practice in the last 10 years. This is the idea that rather than hiring federal employees to do a job, we would hire a private company that's already been doing this and pay them public taxpayer dollars. So they're not necessarily hired by the government, their company is hired by the government. And we use subcontractors for a lot of pieces. And then there's a million more state and local government employees, lots of people for all sorts of different things would be hired or employed by the state. These are all sorts of graphs that are in your book. Let's talk about the organization of the federal bureaucracy. When we talk about the federal bureaucracy, the first thing that should come to your mind is the cabinet. We've already talked about the cabinet, you've already interacted with the cabinet, so I'm not going to spend a great deal of time talking about this, but what you need to know is that it's 15 departments. They all report to the president. They're all headed by what we would consider a secretary. And they are one of just 4 main structures of the federal bureaucracy. In our federal bureaucracy, our 4 main structures would be considered the cabinet, independent executive agencies, independent regulatory agencies, and government corporations. I'm going to say that again. There are 4 main structures in our federal bureaucracy. Number 1, cabinet. Number 2, independent executive agencies. Number 3, independent regulatory agencies. And 4, government corporations. We're going to go through some of these pretty quickly. These are the 4 main structures of federal bureaucracy. If we had to take federal bureaucracy and put it into genres, you're going to find 4. You're going to find things that go in the cabinet, independent executive agencies, independent regulatory agencies, and government corporations. In the cabinet, in that parentheses, what we call line organizations. We consider cabinet departments line organizations because they have a direct line to the president. Who is the boss of the cabinet? The president. It's a very clear, distinct line, straight from the president to all of the 15 cabinet departments. Okay, independent executive agencies. Your book talks a little bit about independent agencies by saying that they're not part of the cabinet, but they do report directly to the president. So an independent executive agency is outside the cabinet, but still has a very good pull on the president's ear. One of these would be the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. The EPA is often in cabinet level department meetings. They're just not considered part of the cabinet. Then we go into independent regulatory agencies. This is where we see the majority of agencies that we know of today. They are outside of the major executive departments, and they're charged with implementing rules and regulations. So their main purpose here is to take what the laws say and to make them applicable to today's life. So when the president says that every U.S. citizen needs to have health care either provided from their employer or from the marketplace, it is the job of independent regulatory agencies to make sure that those rules and regulations are enforced. Yes, Mark?
So does the EPA qualify as just an independent executive agency or an independent regulatory agency?
So they're going to be considered an independent executive agency.
Okay.
They have a regulatory piece though.
Okay.
But yes, we're going to consider them an independent executive agency because they're at that top level.
Okay.
They're supposed to make technical, non-political decisions about rates and profits and rules that would benefit all. This is their purpose. But what we often find is a concept called agency capture. I really want to make sure that you understand what agency capture is. This is an act by which an industry being regulated by a government agency gains direct or indirect control over the agency personnel. So I'll give you an example. BP is a great example of this. BP is a massive organization or a private company of petroleum, of gas. And a number of years ago, you probably remember this, hopefully, that there was a very large gas leak, oil leak, off the coast, the Gulf of Mexico, in the Gulf of Mexico. An oil rig that was drilling into the floor of the ocean broke, essentially. They think that there was a small earthquake, and so things got moved, and all of a sudden it was spewing gallons and gallons of oil into the water every day, and obviously it's a huge national crisis. They can't find a way to cap this oil from spewing into the water, and it continues to spill for like 2 weeks. When all is said and done, everyone steps back and sort of says, how did this happen? How is BP such a major organization and they've got an oil rig that is so susceptible to damage from a small issue? What ended up happening is that we found out that the agency had been captured by the EPA, essentially. That there were high-level people in the EPA who had been captured by BP. Essentially, they were being bribed by BP to not look at oil rigs as closely as they should have been. And so what ended up happening is that they were skirting around regulations and inspections because they've been captured. And we see a lot. People who work in these agencies, they interact with their regulatory agency a lot. So someone like BP is going to work with the EPA all the time. On a daily basis, they're going to be in contact with the EPA. Why? Because the EPA is constantly inspecting all the different aspects of their business. When that happens, sometimes they gain friendships and they gain relationships, and they're able to use specifically financial contributions to sort of take care of those people in the EPA and sort of get what they want. It happens a lot, and it's an important piece of bureaucracy. Deregulation and re-regulation, hopefully this kind of seemed pretty obvious to you. Deregulation is the idea of taking away regulations. There are a lot of people who wish that we would deregulate a lot of things, take out some of these minuscule rules and procedures that maybe don't make sense in everyday life. Re-regulation is the idea of either putting back into place a regulation or changing a regulation to do something in a different way. Okay, government corporations is the last piece we're going to talk about for the four structures of bureaucracy. And we've got two really good examples. The U.S. Postal Service is probably the best example of a government corporation. Amtrak is also another piece. A government corporation is a piece of the executive branch or of the federal government, essentially, but they're not there to make a profit. So we consider them a quasi-business enterprise. They run like a business, they serve you like a business, they have employees and structure like a business, but their ultimate goal is not to have a CEO make money off of it. The idea is that it's a government-run corporation. The government ultimately backs them. And if you know anything about the Postal Service, they actually haven't been making a profit for the last decade-ish. In fact, it's kind of confusing. When you take a look at the Postal Service, it looks like they're coming out even, looks like they're coming out just fine. But what they're not telling you is that they're taking loans from the government, because they're a government corporation. They take loans at a lower interest rate, so they're actually in debt because they are loaning money to continue to stay in service. The Postal Service has been talking for a very long time about changing some things. I think they're taking off Saturday deliveries in some areas. They are hiring out specific things. There's talk about them not doing packages because UPS, FedEx are so vast and far-reaching that at this point it's not worth it. But at this point they haven't made any major moves to change yet. Amtrak's the same way, but Amtrak's gonna live to see another day here. Maybe not this year, but last year Amtrak had one of their best years that they've ever had, and part of that was because of high gas prices. When gas prices are high, Amtrak does really well. Amtrak is a public train service, transit service. Obviously, we don't have a lot of Amtrak here. East Coast, it's very prevalent. People use the Amtrak a lot. They weren't doing well for a little while, but it really kind of varies on gas prices. So maybe this year will not be a good year for Amtrak. Challenges to bureaucracy. So reorganizing to stop terrorism. There's a big, if we're looking at the timeline of bureaucracy, there is a big problem / bump right after 9/11. After 9/11, it becomes really obvious that the bureaucracy, something's flawed in the bureaucracy because we did not see that terrorist attack coming, and we definitely should have. There were a lot of clues. There are a lot of red flags in the story of 9/11, but the bureaucracy sucked it all up, didn't talk to one another, and then nobody knew what was happening. So after 9/11, George W. Bush takes it as a huge initiative to go and reorganize some of the bureaucracy to stop terrorism. First and foremost, he creates the Department of Homeland Security. He takes a bunch of separate organizations, he melds them all together so that they're finally communicating with each other. When they have tips, when they have suspicious activity, each of the other organizations knows it, and that's really important. Homeland Security was established in 2003, if you want some dates. And then the second piece that challenges bureaucracy is natural disasters. Natural disasters always make bureaucracy look bad. It's not always a great way for bureaucracy to shine. We would always wish that they would, but almost always they don't. And probably one of the biggest ways here is Hurricane Katrina and FEMA. FEMA is considered a bureaucratic organization. They're an independent executive agency. They report to the president, and they don't do very well at managing natural disasters. Part of it is that they don't always have the budget that they need. If there's any money that's going to have to get reorganized, it's usually going to come from FEMA. Why? Because presidents always cross their fingers that while they are president, there won't be a major national disaster and they can take that money and put it elsewhere. Problem is that you're really gambling with nature there. And sometimes it works out really well and sometimes it doesn't. Okay, staffing the bureaucracy. There are two categories of staff in the bureaucracy. Number one is political appointees. Number two is what we call civil servants. Political appointees, just what it sounds like essentially. It's the idea that the president fills positions. You often hear it called filling positions in the plum book. This is the idea that when a president becomes president, he essentially gets this plum book that has all of the appointed positions, and the president goes and fills all of them. Usually these are handpicked by the president. These are his advisors and prominent individuals who will be in his executive branch. The aristocracy of the federal government. So this is the idea that political appointees are always considered higher up than civil servants. They're considered handpicked. They're considered to be kind of the elite of the elite. They are appointed because of their network. However, they don't stay very long. Political appointees average about a 3-year employment in the federal government. Civil servants, on the other hand, they stay for their whole lifetime. Civil servants are usually those people who feel the need to serve. People like teachers, people like librarians, people who are passionate about what they do, passionate about who they serve, and they'll often stay for their whole life. They also often stay for their whole life because it's really difficult to fire civil servants. Why? Because civil servants often feel like they are fired in a wrong way. There are a lot of civil suits that happen from civil servants. People have often felt like they got fired because they spoke out. So when you work for the federal government, it's a little different, right? Could I go and protest in Washington, D.C. tomorrow, and could my boss fire me tomorrow? Yeah. Would it be because of that? Maybe, maybe not, but I would certainly have a case there. Because in a private company, that wouldn't be allowed. You have your freedom of speech, you have your freedom to go do whatever you want. And it's not to say that civil servants don't have that right, but oftentimes it looks very bad for the federal government. You're representing a larger group, and so things like, am I putting out a bunch of pictures of myself on Facebook? Going out with my friends? No. Does my peer who works for the Red Cross get to do that? Yeah. This is a private entity, essentially. So there are a little bit different pieces here when we talk about hiring and hiring. Okay, I'm going to stop you there, but I do want to do this because I feel like bureaucracy is so difficult and sometimes hard to understand. I'm going to give you an example of interaction with the bureaucracy. 2 weeks ago, I filled out my registration to vote. Okay, first of all, we're not done with class, so just chill for a second, okay? 2 weeks ago, I went to register to vote. I filled out my registration. I sent it in the mail because you can't do it online in the state of Wisconsin, which is ridiculous. But I sent in this piece of paper. This kind woman from Lake Mills calls me and says that she can't process my registration because she has to have it handed to her in person. She can't take it in the mail 2 weeks before a voting, which was last Tuesday for the a couple of Supreme Court justice and a couple of other options. So essentially what I had to do was go down to the county clerk's office. She was going to hand me the piece of paper back. I was going to hand the piece of paper back to her, and then she could officially file my voter registration form. That's bureaucracy, and that's what makes people pretty cranky about bureaucracy. Because why does it matter? It doesn't matter, but it's part of the rules and regulations that some executive department has gone ahead and said. Somewhere in our state government, the governor at some point said that within 2 weeks of a voting deadline, voter registrations that are sent in the mail have to actually be handed in by person. So what I ended up doing is she just left it in her mailbox, and then the day after Tuesday, so last Wednesday, she went and filed my voter registration because I wasn't going to vote. I had conferences and I couldn't get there anyway. So it's one of those pieces that's bureaucracy right there. It's hard to describe, it's hard to explain. She doesn't even know why she has to have me handed to her, but it is the way that it is. So something to sort of keep in mind when we're talking about this idea. Okay, you are finished with lecture for today. We will hopefully finish this tomorrow, although this is taking us a little longer than I had hoped to do.